So here's my question. Did you guys fill in while I was absent, or did you stare at each other for a minute? I was just kind of curious how that would happen, since I didn't have a chance to tell everybody that in the middle of that, my technology shut down. So it said it was working, but the sermon never came up. So I ran upstairs to print my sermon, which, of course, I have the slowest printer in the universe. So thank you, and my apologies. But that gave you a moment to decide whether or not you wanted to stay. Would have been a good time to leave. So my son and I don't know if, my wife and I don't know if you guys did this. Did you all participate in Halloween last night? Everybody in costume?
We gave up candy. No.
Gave up candy?
I didn't get any trick-or-treater.
Oh, no. Well, where is David? David Smoot told me a wonderful story. I'm going to go ahead and share it. He said in his neighborhood, which I guess over here off of 7th Street, in that area over off Camp Bowie and 7th Street, there was one house where they were giving away toothbrushes. He said he wished he'd had a camera just to see the expression of children's faces when they were handed toothbrushes. I, on the other hand, went with my wife over to the Magnolia area, over to the Paramount area where my kids live, and where Michael and Stan live, and they have a great house. And so on the porch, everybody's out on their porches. And so we dressed up in this. Can you pull it up there? There we are. That's actually not Linda, but that's a kid that walked up all of a sudden. I put on that mask, and my mother looked up from the candy bag and saw this. And then I remembered Michael said, she's 88 years old. Maybe you shouldn't have, startled her. But we had a great time, and what was interesting is we were giving out candy. Of course, the kids come up, and there was this one kid who was in a Darth Vader costume, and he was probably 4 years old. And he came up on the steps. His parents were down the sidewalk watching him. He had the mask on and everything, and we're 3 steps up to the porch, so you have to literally want to come get the candy, right? Because you got to walk on the porch, you got to walk by this guy, and then get to the older lady who's got the basket of candy. And so this kid comes up, and he's a little tenuous at the steps. The mask, I'm sure, is difficult. He steps up onto the porch, and he's got his beeline. He's got the eyes focused on the prize. So he's walking over, and he gets up a couple of handfuls, or just a handful of candy. He turns around and starts back to the step, which is when he notices that. He notices this guy with the pointed head and the shaggy hair, and he just kind of freezes. Unfortunately, he froze with his foot out. But he hasn't taken a step yet. He's in this midpoint of what's going on, what's happened here. And he hears somebody, it's his mom or his dad, says, look out where you're going. And so that's when he kind of focuses back again, and he starts to step down. I mean, it's a little tenuous for a little 4-year-old in a costume with a Darth Vader mask on. And as he's stepping down, something suddenly catches his attention. I guess he's wondering if he got the candy after all, because now he's looking up like he's trying to see his hand while he's stepping onto the bottom step. And he takes that left foot and starts to step forward as he's looking at his hand. And clearly, this kid has no sense of where he's going, only what he's looking at. And that's when someone else shouts, look out, to which he turns and falls on the sidewalk. And, of course, there's the screaming and there's crying, and he's fine, and he's a little bruised. But the most important thing is he looks up, and he's still got his candy. And he starts to walk off. And I was thinking, what Richard Rohr says is that when we fall, where we're looking isn't always the issue. Oftentimes, it's where we're not looking. Fear finds its power, he says, in not looking, and even more so in looking away. So over the week, as I was doing some research and studying on this, I found this site called the Forgiveness Project. And it was initiated in the UK, but it's all over the world now. One of the early people involved with this was a woman by the name of Marion Partington. And she lives in the UK, and her book just came out a couple of years ago, which is entitled, I Sit Very Still. I'm sorry, If You Sit Very Still. And in the book, she tells the story of how her Sister Lucy had disappeared at the age of 21. It was back in the mid-late 70s, and she was on her way to a night class and disappeared. And for 20 years, they lived with this sense of horror of not knowing what had happened, and just this vague numbness, right, to this new reality that is just numb and dark. And then in the mid-1990s, they found her body, and of course it was buried in the basement of some house that wasn't too far away in another community, and that in fact it had been a serial killer that they had been looking for some time. And that actually led to their finding the serial killer, a couple. The story that ensued was just this cruel, ambivalent coldness that actually seemed to make things worse for Marion and for her family, but particularly for Marion because she was close to her younger sister. And she found herself needing to get away. She decided that I just need to be somewhere privately. But the problem with that was as she pursued this private retreat, she began to discover that the nightmares that she continued to experience, the visions, the scenes over and over, they only created in her a deeper sense of murderous revenge. She couldn't let go of this sense of just deep, dark revenge. But she had the sense about her, perhaps the consciousness about her, to say, if I continue with this, not only will it destroy me eventually, but it will certainly destroy everyone with whom I have contact. The same terror, the same revenge, the same deep hatred that wells in me is going to find its way out in every relationship I have and with my children, and it will continue. And so she decided to do something radical, she said. She just sat with it. She went on a second retreat and sat with it. She said that at some point, she entered with it. She wrestled with it. Brene Brown came out with a new book recently. Lynn and I have been talking back and forth about it. You know about Brene Brown and all of her research with vulnerability and the TED Talks. Those are so famous for her coming out and just sharing this vulnerability and how powerful and profound that experience is. Well, she wrote a new book called Rising Strong, and it's a good book. I've only glanced at it, but I'm going to dive into it. She talks about how to face those deep disasters, those deep crises, those deep darknesses within us, whether it's shame or loss or pain or suffering or illness. She talks about how to face that. And one of the things she says is that you have to face the darkness with curiosity, which I think is an interesting idea. You have to be willing to enter it with curiosity. She said that's exactly what Marion said she did. She said, I entered it, I wrestled with it, and then she says, I created with it. And eventually, she writes, I discovered that in my sister's murderers was a sense of myself, and remarkably, a sense of their own humanity. And she began to redefine words instead of forgiveness, because that seems still like something I have to do for someone else. She defined the term forgivenness, the way life is and the way we live it with one another, and that it's given for in as much as it's a givenness. So she learned how to live with this in a way that allowed the pain, but at the same time engaged it. And as a consequence, she was one of those early people to work with the Forgiveness Project and continues to work with that, which works with victims and the criminals. Richard Rohr said that fear often gets its power from not looking or from looking away too hard, which we might think of as running. Whether it's a big loss or a sudden loss of a loved one or a divorce or a diagnosis of cancer or simply a small kind of darkness that we face all the time in our relationships with others, at staff or in family, and little bitternesses that develop and the little dynamics that develop where we just let people get under our skin somehow. That when we fall and we avoid being with that pain, we allow it to root and we allow it to fuel. And we find ourselves living out of that defensiveness and bitterness that arises simply from what Richard Rohr calls the unknowing. Richard Rohr suggests it's difficult for us, especially when we spend most of our lives, as we've talked about in that first half of a life, where it's all about controlling, where it's all about establishing, where it's all about defining ourselves. In the first half of life, the world is a lot like Shakespeare said, right? Do you remember the quote, "All the world is a stage and we're merely players on it"? It's a very dualistic way of looking at the world. But it's also the way that a lot of us live our lives. We find ourselves sort of living out life in a way that either has been sort of a destiny for us, or perhaps a part of our family history, or perhaps a self-made direction. And nonetheless, though, we still define ourselves in contrast to others. We define ourselves in how we establish our ultimate identity and make our way. But then Richard Rohr says that dualistic way, which is not a bad way, by the way. It's interesting if you get to the end of the book. I'm not sure how many of you are reading the book, but when you get to the end, it's amazing how all of this starts to make sense. We need dualistic thinking. We definitely need ways of somehow defining ourselves against an issue or figuring out how to resolve something. But at the same time, if we don't allow ourselves to see the connections, if we don't engage this understanding of things as interconnected, then what happens is we get trapped in dualistic thinking. We never get out of this small-mindedness. We never see the bigger picture. We continue to live out of patterns because that's dualistic living. We end up in patterns like a stage, and we play our parts. So that when we suddenly fall on our faces, or we screw up, or we're the victims of a disease, there is no healthy ending. Now, that's not to say that doctors can't provide a cure, but there's no ultimate healthy ending to that. And for many people, there doesn't seem to be a reason, right? There doesn't seem to be a reason for that mystery, for that suffering. And Richard Rohr says it's because that's where we need to move beyond. And as Marion mentioned in her book, as Brene Brown says in her book, that's the one place where we are suddenly invited into a greater mystery. I hope you read the text. I'm going to try practicing this. I know that I was with Sharm Robarts in Disciple Church, and I know that they put their text in the top of the bulletin, and then they never read it. It's kind of assumed that you'll read it. I thought maybe we'll try that and just see if you read the text. So now I'm looking at you and you're all going like, "No, I didn't read the text there. I saw that. I didn't know that. I figured somebody else will do that for me." But if you'll read that text, it's amazing, this idea from Isaiah, this lamenting. Where is God in the midst of our travails? Where is God when we're having these conflicts and problems? And as the text says, don't you know anything? Haven't you been listening? God doesn't come and go. God lasts. God is creator of all you see. God doesn't tire, pause to catch a breath. The Holy of all energizes those who get tired and strengthens the dropouts. And then I love this last line, but those who wait upon God get fresh strength. They spread their wings and soar like eagles. Richard Rohr argues in his book that when we learn to see the world not as separate, but as all connected, that we live in the midst of God's reality and God lives in the midst of our lives, that we are connected to one another in profound ways, we begin seeing our relationships differently. He calls it a second naivete, because it literally changes the way we view the world. The world is now larger. It's wholly interconnected. Mystery empowers us with a deeper joy and a sense of the one in whom we live and move and have our being. But he argues, and this was the hard part. I've mentioned this several times in this series, and I know I've gotten feedback from folks too. This is the hard part. He argues that in reality, ultimately, sometimes the only way to get to second sight, to get to that second naivete, is through the suffering. The only way to face that way of seeing the world larger is to face suffering. A friend of mine, I've mentioned in here, Michael Goldstein, he was a clown, but he really called himself a fool, and he worked with kids in cancer, at cancer hospitals, kids with cancer, as well as camps for kids, pediatric oncology camps. And he called himself Mickle the Pickle, but after years, he changed it because that didn't really say what he was all about. In fact, it said sometimes the wrong thing. And so he changed his name to the Sheriff of Fun. And whenever he went in, he enforced fun. That was kind of his role. And I actually got an email from Michael recently, Michael Goldstein, because he, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, was diagnosed a few months back with fourth stage non-Hodgkin's cancer. And we've been emailing back and forth a little bit, and he's shared with me sort of what this has been about for him, because there's a sense of irony in it as well, that he spent his life working with children with cancer and then contracts the disease himself. And he said he likened it to being with the trapeze artists that we used to work with. I don't know, was there ever there when you were there at that camp, the circus? They were there twice? Yeah, and it's amazing. They brought in a circus, and they brought in a trapeze artist, and they set up the trapeze that's about 25, 30 feet above the ground with a net about 6 feet off the ground. And then the kids would line up, and anybody willing to do that, as well as the adults, got this experience. The strange experience, of course, is that you did it, right? You got up and did it. Of course you did it, yes. Yeah. I'm not going to risk leaping from 30 feet up in the air. Are you kidding? The challenging thing about it is that if you've ever watched, you have to lean out to grab the swing. Now, it'll be tied up. The person who landed there will tie it up to the edge, and it's kind of standing at an angle, because you can only grab it with one hand and stay balanced. If you grab it with two hands, you are off balance. When you grab with the second hand, you have committed to the fall. You've committed to it. And it's a strange reality, because the first time, maybe even the second time, I've done it a few times, but as you're holding that, you have this strange sensation of which you are literally saying, I'm going to lean out and fall. And it's not just a matter of trusting. There's this anxiety that just is hard to define, right? You're the one holding. There's no other cable holding you. You're just holding on to it, and you're going to swing out there. And some of us actually got to swing out and do a flip, because we'd already swung out and landed, and so we kind of pushed ourselves. But as you're doing it, you're looking down. And he said when he did it the first time, he was looking down, and he saw the kids looking up going, you can do it, Mickle, you can do it, Mickle. And he was looking down feeling this courage, right? And the kids encouraging him. But he said something interesting happened to him that he discovered now that he's having cancer. He said, I noticed that they were mirroring my anxiety. But at the same time, some of them were mirroring not courage. They weren't saying just you can do it. He looked at the trapeze artist himself, and he looked at some of the others who had done it. And their smile was one which said, you won't believe what this is like. You can't imagine. It was like an invitation. He said they were mirroring something completely different, and he said it overwhelmed him so that he realized he needed to do the same thing, because those kids were looking at him with the you can do it, but they weren't seeing the invitation. And so he began to smile with this sense of playfulness that he was characteristic of, and he reached out, grabbed it, and let go and swung in the air. And then he said as soon as he got up in the air, he didn't do a flip. It was awkward. He twirled up and landed flat on his back and bounced up and down on his back. And of course it looked funny because, your butt comes up in the air, and then everybody's laughing and everybody's cheering. He said, Tom, when he was telling me about this, he said, the thrill was not in flying. The thrill was in letting go. The thrill was that strange moment when I was suddenly not aware. I just reached, and I let go. The consequence was, I looked like a total idiot because I landed, and it was all awkward and got tangled up in the net, and everybody had a good laugh. But it was that moment where everything seemed the same. I wrote in my blog this past week that I got on my bicycle for the first time. I don't know how many of you read that. You can go back and check about the bicycle accident. I can pull down my arm, but I don't want to disgust you. There's a nice big old scar right here. And there's a bruise on my hip, and I won't show you that. But I'm okay. I'm okay. You can read about the accident. What was interesting was that after I got back on the bike and I rode to the park, I had this wonderful experience of seeing a couple of birds. And it was like an elderly bird, like maybe the mama bird, the papa bird. It was a blue jay, and then another little bird in the nest. And they were calling back and forth, and it was very clear that this one had been trying to get that one to leave its nest. And what I realized was that this one was just, it wasn't going to do it. It was just as if it's saying, like, I know I'm supposed to, birds fly, I'm not going out there. And this other one's saying, like, you don't know what's out there, you don't know what's waiting for you, it's amazing. If you just open your wings, reality is waiting for you to just open your wing. It's going to receive you. But again, the bird wasn't going to do it. And it suddenly happened. It was like this moment, right? It's not the moment when I decide, now I'm going to take a risk. Think about when you've done something that was risky. Think about a time when you finally faced something that you refused to face. Maybe it was in a counseling session. Maybe it was with a friend you were talking with. Maybe it was on a retreat on your own. But at some point, you faced something that you just didn't think you could face. That's that strange moment, that mysterious moment where I believe God is in our midst, where everything seems to be one and the same, all things the same side of a single coin. The teacher, the student, the parent, the child, the resistance and the invitation, the fear and the excitement. All of that seems to somehow become one. And that's when I looked up and the bird just jumped out of nowhere. It wasn't chirping, it wasn't doing anything, it jumped. And of course it fluttered and it almost fell and it landed on a lower branch. And then literally it was kind of hysterical because the bird kind of shook its head like, what just happened? And then it looked back and looked back at the bird. And I didn't stick around, but it flapped its wings a couple of times and I figured it's probably going to do it again. But that first time. Richard Rohr says that when we experience this sense of darkness, this sense of abandonment, the holy in our midst is always inviting. And sometimes the only way to get there, if no one's there to mirror it for us, is to just trust with curiosity. Brene Brown, engage it. Wrestle with it. Run toward it. And as we enter into it, we discover something. We discover that acknowledging our pain, at the edge of that, without doubt, but instead with curiosity and without judgment, which is something I think we sometimes can practice in our relationships, in our staff, as well as on our road, in our relationships and with each other. Instead, engage with this curious empathy. I wonder how you are really a lot like me. Or I wonder how I'm really a lot like you. Or that thing that you do that I don't like is probably because there's something about me that I don't like. When we can begin to enter into our shadows with curiosity, Richard Rohr says we've already stepped into the bigger picture, the place where God is awaiting to transform our fear into joy. Amen.